Hi everybody, I'm David Reardon, and I'm the designer and the director of the original It Came from the Desert video game. And we did that at CinemaWare in 1989 to 1991. There were 3 different versions, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I've been asked to share some of the inspirations behind the game that obviously influenced Marco and his team when they made their homage to the big bug movie, It Came from the Desert. And let me just say, for all of us that worked on the video game, we are so excited what they did with this. And we're going to get into that in a minute and all the little secrets between the game and the movie.
Lucas, where are you?
We're trapped by this giant ant.
Trapped by a what?
A giant freaking ant!
The desert, unchanged for millions of years, yet witness to a biblical prophecy come true that one day the meek shall inherit the earth.
Now, the story of It Came from the Desert actually begins a long time ago in 1954. And I'm 7 years old. I know that kind of dates me, but I'm 7 years old and I'm watching television, and probably in the afternoon, and on the TV comes this movie called Them. And it was directed by Gordon Douglas, which I didn't know at the time, but it was black and white. It had these giant cheesy ants in it, but it was actually a pretty serious film about a subject we'll get into in a minute.
We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy come true, and there shall be destruction and darkness come up in creation, and the beast shall reign over the earth.
So the theme that Gordon Douglas, the director of Them, was playing with is fairly serious. I mean, it's 1954, not that far from the Second World War ending, where we dropped A-bombs on Japan to end it. And of course, we've all seen the footage of the atom bomb tests out in the desert, mostly in Nevada. And when you read the stories of those tests, you'd be amazed what they did. I mean, they walked soldiers down to ground zero after they had blown the bomb off. So obviously, later on, there were radiation problems.
But born in that swirling inferno of radioactive dust were things so horrible, so terrifying, so hideous. There is no word to describe them.
So what Douglas was playing with was this idea that we had unleashed something that we really didn't understand, and this could be the end of us in a certain sort of way. So even in 1989, when we start the game, this whole notion of the fear of nuclear war is still very much with us. So one of the things is you can't really talk about It Came from the Desert without actually talking about the time frame that it existed in. So 1989, the first of the video game machines have come about, the first very basic computers. But the whole notion of interactive movies and games was actually something that was just absolutely brand new. This whole notion of moving from linear stories to interactive stories where the players or participants could actually direct the story to a certain extent. I mean, it was still an authored body of material, but they could make choices about where they wanted to go. And that was a really interesting idea, but so early. And Desert was right at the beginning of that whole transition from linear storytelling to interactive storytelling. So as a record artist and a fledgling movie producer, I had no idea that this was actually even possible. And I was working at Lucasfilm doing another project for them. And this was after the second Star Wars, so of course Lucasfilm has more money than God, and they're interested in investing in all these, in quotes, new technologies. And this was actually much earlier than 1989 when we did Desert. This was back 1980, 81. And so I got this great job. I got to go out and talk to people about all the new technologies at that time, which were satellite television, a whole bunch of things. But where I ended up that really influenced this story was I ended up at MIT and in a strange place called the Architectural Machine Group. Now, for those of you that know, that's the precursor to the Media Lab, which now exists and has done all kinds of wonderful work. But at the time, I just walked in there as a West Coast kid and they wanted to show me something. So they sat me down in a chair and they pointed to this object right in front of me and they said, "That is a joystick." And I'm going, okay, I'll play. That's a joystick? What actually am I supposed to do with it? And they said, well, you've got to push it forward, and then this image on the screen, which happened to be Aspen, Colorado, was a street scene, it'll animate, and then you can drive around Aspen, Colorado. I'm still sitting there going, I'm not exactly sure what this means, but I'll play. So I push the stick forward, the picture animated, and I'm literally driving around Aspen, Colorado. I can make turns, I can decide that I want to go left, right, or straight, and all that. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't know about driving around Aspen, Colorado, how interesting that is, but as a storyteller, this is fascinating. Even though I didn't know anything about it at the time, that was the seed that got planted early and that eventually shows up when we do It Came from the Desert about 7 years later. Those of us that actually wanted to work in this fledgling business, because nobody knew anything about this. I mean, there were choose your own adventure books where you literally would go, I can go either there or there, but you learn very quickly as a storyteller that those possibilities ran out. So we had to design something else. And so we were looking for places to work. And I mentioned the Aspen Project, and it was based on laser discs, which are those magic silver discs that seemed like they were from outer space at the time. And with those, we actually could build arcade games, and we did. And there were some interesting experiments, sort of run and shoot kinds of arcade games using real footage out of movies. The only problem with the arcade games was that the laser discs themselves, when you put them out into coin-op arcades, which are basically bars, they got dusty and then they didn't work. And so all of that particular avenue folded up really quickly. And I thought I was going back into the film business because we had pretty much done everything that was available to us. And it was an interesting idea, but it just didn't seem like it was going anywhere. So I think I'm literally headed back into the film business when a friend of mine brought over an Amiga computer. Now at the time, the Amiga computer was like a big advance in graphics. It had just glorious compared to all the other ones, really good graphics. And he said, you've got to see this game because you've been talking about all that interactive movie stuff. Well, I think these people are doing it. And so what he showed me was CinemaWare's first game, which was called Defender of the Crown. And I was so blown away by it. Even as crude as it was, it had the right orientation. And of course, CinemaWare was the brainchild of Bob and Phyllis Jacob. And they just did a brilliant job marketing this whole thing of movies that become games. And I wrote them a fan letter. That's all I did. And I just said, hey, you guys are actually doing what I only imagined. And they wrote me back and said, gee, you have this sort of curious background of both linear and interactive. In those days, that was pretty unusual. So come in and see us. So I did, and it was very small. And I met John Cutter, who was the original designer for CinemaWare. And we all sat around, and Bob looked across at me, and he says, so if you were going to do a movie and make it into a game, which one would you do? And I said, I didn't even hesitate. I just said, I'd do the Big Bug movie. And he laughed and said, that's the one I didn't think of. Would you like to do that for us? And that's how it got born. One of the things that I got to play with the It Came from the Desert series of video games that didn't happen in the movie. It was more of a serious movie, even though I thought it was very campy and, the creatures were just cheesy beyond belief. And so I had a certain feeling about watching the movie that actually wasn't too serious.
Where human courage challenges the brute force, the slashing jaws, the poison fangs that guard the subterranean nest, where the beast spawns its terrible progeny.
To all units, condition red.
And we played with all of that in the video game. We actually decided that if we were going to hang out in this town of Lizard Breath and do all these different weird characters, that the game would have a sense of humor to it, that it would have the sense of humor that how I felt watching this very serious movie then, and then translating that into It Came from the Desert. So when Marco decided that he was actually going to do a movie that was based and inspired by the game, It Came from the Desert, what he did that I thought was so cool is that he captured the humor of the game.
The subjects require ethanol.
Ethanol?
And that's just something that I appreciate as the designer and one of the writers of it, that ultimately what they chose to do, even though it's their own news story and it has lots of different things in it, they really captured sort of the campiness that we had in the game, and I think you'll really enjoy the movie because of that. So dumb me, I just figured, well, I'll just handle this like a movie. So the first thing we had to do was define a map of the town. So here's the original version of it. Here's the version that ultimately was cleaned up and released with the game. And this is the little town of Lizard Breath.
Holy shit. There's an actual town called Lizard Breath?
So that was kind of cool. And we developed a map of the town. And then, of course, we did characters and we did situations. So what did we do? We did storyboards, just like we would do with a normal movie, even though the final outcome was going to be these very crude graphics. Basically, I just said, I've got to storyboard this whole thing and think about the characters and the locations, and that way the artist can, create of all these things. The second big idea that Desert came up with and was part of this evolution of how do you build these things and how do you design these games, which now is all just commonplace, but at the time, nobody really was doing this. And I'm sure Desert may have been one or two that did this, and that was most of the games basically allowed you all the time in the world to make the next choice. So that if you were going to go and fight a certain army, you could do that, or you could sit back and you could do other things, or you could talk to characters and so on. And I just didn't think that that was very movie-like, because in movies, the timeline moves along, and there's a lot of creative tension about you can't be everywhere at once, so your characters are making choices to be certain places, and there are certain outcomes about that. So I thought with Desert, that's what we had to do. We had to do a ticking clock. So ultimately, the ants would start far out of town, just like they do in the movie, and ultimately they would move toward the center of town, and then you had the option of talking to the characters, to actually jumping into games where you were trying to destroy them or gain some information that would help you figure out where they were. All of that was basically done on a ticking clock. And that was a new idea at the time. And so when we look at the map in the game, when you made a choice to go from one side of the map to the other, there was a big time chunk that was taken out of your clock, because when the clock hit zero, no matter what you had done, the ants ate the town. So you were constantly running around and dealing with the fact that they were getting closer and closer, and you had to figure out a way to stop them. And that, I think, actually was really a cool part of the game, and why it was so popular when it came out, and people just loved that idea. So with all of that sort of initially laid out, I had the map, I had the characters, I had the locations. We assembled a great team at Cinemore, and Bob and Phyllis had done a great job in hiring coders to actually do the coding of the game, some really outstanding graphic artists, and then we started bringing in writers that would actually write scripts, because we're dealing with interactive movies here. So I formed this team, and Randy Platt was the head programmer who just did wonders in trying to fit this big vision that I had onto, are you ready for this? 3 floppy disks, which at the time was unheard of. Most games were built so they were just on 1 floppy disk. That meant that you had to put disks in at certain points, and of course that complicated the design, but we figured it all out, and really who figured all of that out was Randy. And then we had the Jeffs that were doing the graphics, and and Cinemaware was known for its great graphics, and they really did a great job in capturing the characters. And then I brought in Ken Melville, who was a friend of mine that was a screenwriter and interested like me in this new medium. And we actually worked out, all of the script of the original games, and then in Desert 3, where we actually had actors, we actually were having actors actually speak the line, so that was really fun.
What you come here for, boy, huh? You gonna buy yourself a big old piece to keep away the boogeyman?
One of the things that we also had to deal with was the music and the sound, and of course the Amiga computer. The music was crude, but it was critical. And I do remember as a kid when I was watching the movie, I wasn't particularly scared about it. I mean, the ants were, sort of cheesy looking, and the characters were sort of larger than life. Which was all fun stuff for us to play with in terms of the video game. But ultimately that sound had to be there, and so Randy figured out a way with our sound designers to actually do that. So Greg Haggard and Jim Simmons actually came up with the music for the game, which the first time I heard it, I said, this is just so on the mark. And one of the funny things that I thought Marco did in the film, and you'll see this, it happens very quickly, one of the characters' phone rings, right, because we're in 2018, so they actually have cell phones as opposed to the original story. And that ultimately the ringtone on the phone is the music out of the game, which Marco and I have just laughed about, and I so appreciated that he included that.
You think I'd be this scared of a giant panda bear? Because I'd much rather... Answer it! Get off! Lisa?
So all of that effort, big team, lots of coding, lots of graphics, writing, and me directing all of those things, actually went into, and here is the original Bible for the original game. It came from the desert, and this includes not only all the storyboards, but all of the timing matrix that said, all right, on day 14, if you're sitting at the farm, this is what happens, right? So all of that, just like a movie, was, combined into this particular Bible, which I just didn't know what else to do. So we did that, and then that really informed when we went to make Desert 3, which actually had actors in it, that really then started to set us up for doing things that were much closer, even in a very crude form, toward television and film. So obviously, if it's a big bug film, the most important thing to get right visually is the actual ants themselves, and as they show up and scare everybody in the game. So I thought that both Jeffs did an actually really good job, again, with very limited capabilities of the Amiga computer. And so obviously here is the first ant that walked around in both Desert 1 and Desert 2. And they would show up in this version, and there was also an aerial version if you were trying to bomb them, or there were more than just one or whatever. So we did all of that. And then in Desert 3, because we had a CD-ROM, which at the time seemed like just an unreasonable amount of space to put data in, how could we possibly fill that out? Well, at the time when we were shooting video and actually doing stop-motion models for the ants, and you can see a scene here where this is what the ant looked like in the TurboGrafx version, which was Desert 3, that was a whole different deal. So even though the TurboGrafx system looks horrible, I'll just say it's just awful, and it frustrated all of us, this was a stepping stone towards some things that would come later, that we were actually playing with real film techniques as we were making the game. When you spend a year of your life and you have no idea what you're doing, and this was my first video game that I ever designed, and even though I loved what we did, I mean, you just never know how it's going to be received. But it turned out it came from the desert, really struck a nerve with the audience, and there were just rave reviews, it sold a lot of copies. And so obviously we were thinking, well, I guess we'll have to do another one. Now, the interesting thing about that is that my original design, are you ready for this, had 9 different scenarios. And Randy Platt, I remember the day when he walked into my office and said, okay, so I've looked at all of what we can put on 3 floppy disks, and you can have 1 scenario, not 9. But the other 8 were sitting there, and one of them we decided was going to be Desert 2. And this got into the whole notion of the ant mind, which was this sort of energetic thing that was controlling everybody's movements, and the people would actually turn into ants and do different things as we were playing with sort of the whole zombie picture of that. So when we looked at how we were going to do this, and there was a lot of pressure in the marketplace to get the second game out because everybody wanted to play the next one, we actually did something that was kind of original. We took the original game and we actually just added we replaced, I should say, one disc of the 3, and that one disc was the same town, same creatures, but a new story, or a new advanced story where something had happened since the first one. So that was Antmind. And again, one of the things that I loved about what Marco did in the film, and only I would know about this, or if people really knew the game, they would know the second one was called Antmind, is that when they're running around in the tunnels, they run by a sign. It's not explained, and simply it just says Antmind on the door, as if Marco's setting up to actually do Desert 2. So we'll have to see how all that goes. So we've talked a little bit about Desert 3, and it was a big advance, even though when I look at it these days, I just go, there's actually, I like the graphics in the first 2 games better. It was just something about the TurboGrafx system that was challenging. And it was particularly challenging because we were actually shooting, real actors against green screen, and that was big news in Hollywood at the time. as all the press started to focus on games and movies and all that stuff that could come about, which eventually did, they were curious that we were actually shooting actors, so they would come to the set and we would shoot against green screen. So what made that all work was one of these, and it's a CD-ROM, and as I said, that had much more data capacity than 3 just regular old floppy disks, and so we could do more, and of course we pushed it to the limit, which is one of the reasons why Desert 3 is what it is. So all of the stuff that we did in TurboGrafx really led us to what we eventually did with Voyeur, which got quite a bit of notice when it came out because of its adult themes. And then finally, in the course of very short period of time, 3 to 4 to 5 years, we had full motion video became available to us on the technology, and we ended up doing full interactive television shows where we would actually shoot a television show and shoot an interactive version of it at the same time. And as you can imagine, this was crazy making to produce, and we actually did the first of those with Hulk Hogan, which all of you know, and it was called Thunder in Paradise, and we shot it down at the Disney Studios in Florida, 500-page script, and my God, that was an enterprise. But that's where it all went. So we started very crudely with It Came from the Desert, but very quickly, this all morphed into something else that got much closer to television and movies, but were still games that were fun to play.
We're short on time. We'll go that way, you go this way. Find the major. You got 1 shot, so make it count. Move!
So I hope this has been helpful to understand a little bit of the inspirations of the video game and also the place that it sort of had in video game history, which was unique for its time. And obviously we are, as I said before, thrilled what Marco and his team have done, with the movie. And I'll tell you, who knows? Somewhere out there in the quiet of the desert, buried in some tunnel someplace, the next version of It Came from the Desert just might be birthing itself. So stay tuned.